Hi, friends. Welcome to another episode of Soaring Through Chaos. And as always, the purpose of these talks is to remind ourselves that through all the challenges we are going through, we are now in the second wave of the pandemic. It's during these difficult times, it's during these challenges that there are opportunities for growth. It's never easy, but if life was easy, we probably wouldn't grow as much. And with me here is somebody I've admired. I first heard him when he came and spoke with us at the Center for Compassion at Stanford. And you were actually the first business person to speak at CCARE, and that delighted me because I came from a business background in tech, and I was like, okay, because I was a volunteer at CCARE. So what brought you to CCARE, and tell us about your journey?
Sure. Well, first of all, I'm just honored to be with you, Shankar. I have a lot of respect for how you show up in the world. So, and I'm enthusiastic to be able to address your community. In terms of CCARE specifically, it was Dr. Jim Doty, who was running CCARE, who asked me to come and speak or be on a panel. In fact, I think I was on a panel with David White, the poet, was sitting next to me, I think.
Yes,
And
yes.
that, he's one of my favorite poets in the world. So that was quite an experience. You know, it's an interesting thing. They say your reputation precedes you, and your reputation precedes you, in essence, is a way of saying that your reputation is your personal brand is something that is almost like part of your identity. And I guess since I started my company when I was 26 years old and ran it for 24 years, my premise in starting that company was to create a company that was dedicated to joy. The company was called Joie de Vivre. It means joy of life in French. And so the whole premise of how we built the mission of the company was to create joy for our employees first and our customers second. And I didn't do any of it for marketing reasons. I mean, I started calling this karmic capitalism. Karmic capitalism, what goes around comes around. And I did it because I thought it was the right thing to do for the business. And it was the right thing. It turns out the business grew. It became the second largest boutique hotel company in the United States. What happened over time was people would ask, I see that you're doing something quite different. You have a very compassionate style of leading your company. Will you come and give a talk about it? And so I would give talks. And then one day a literary agent was in the audience, and she said, you've got a great book in you if you want to write a book. And it's funny, when I was 13 years old, I said to my parents, I want to be an author when I grow up. And my dad said, she didn't say author, I said writer. I want to be a writer when I grow up. And my dad said writers are either poor or psychotic, or sometimes both. And I didn't really even know at age 13 what psychotic meant, but it didn't sound very good. And so I left the idea of being a writer there in my early teen years. And here I now was in my late 30s, having grown a business that was succeeding, and it was being suggested I should be a writer now. And so I decided to write my first book. I've written 5 books now, and my first book came out 20 years ago. And at that time, it was a way of me starting to actually help people to understand the ability for people to bring compassion and emotion into the workplace. I'm going to actually.
Yeah, in fact, conscious capitalism and all these new terms have been around for some time, but you started way early before that became popular in American entrepreneurship or in Silicon Valley in San Francisco. And we are living in very interesting times, even in the San Francisco Bay Area. There's so much division between the tech people, the artists. Even within tech, there's the electronics and biotechnology people have like separate little silos, and then there's the there's the liberals, and then even the homeless people. There are the people who go to Burning Man. What I see interesting is that you don't seem to have any of these boundaries. You seem to go very smoothly between all these different communities. Tell us how you do that and what does that mean to you in your personal life?
You know, that's a great question. I have been culturally curious since I was a young child, and it's partly because my schools that I went to, especially in junior high school and high school, were in the inner city. And so I was a white guy, but I was going to schools that had a lot of non-white people in them. So what it meant was I learned what it meant to be the other. If in the United States, we have the expression the other. And the other is the person who is usually different than you. And often the other is the person who is not in the dominant demographic. So in the United States, the dominant demographic, especially in the business world, would be white, male, straight, fully able, not disabled, generally older in many companies, although in Silicon Valley, it's often generally younger. And in Silicon Valley, it's often not just white. It's, Indian American, Chinese American, a lot of people from the Asian and Indian subcontinent. So I would just say I get so much more out of life when I'm surrounded by people who are different than me. And so that's been part of my ethos, part of my way of operating in the world. And it's part of the way I've built leadership teams. I think it also helps that, I came out as a gay man at age 22. And that helped me to see what does it mean to be, not in the non-dominant sexual orientation, especially having played water polo in college and being in a fraternity and being a CEO at age 26, a gay CEO. That was unusual, especially back in 1986, 1987. And then at Airbnb, I joined a company at age 52 where the average age was 26. And I came to the conclusion pretty quickly, like, I'm not the dominant paradigm here. I'm the minority. I'm the minority as a really older person in a company that was full of millennials. And so each of these times has helped me to realize that when you surround yourself with people who are different than you, you probably learn more, and you probably don't do as much groupthink. Groupthink basically means that everybody sort of thinks alike, or at least talks as if they think alike. So yeah, so that's been my life, and it's part of the reason I live in Mexico now, because it's nice to live in a different culture. It's part of the reason I went to the Maha Kumbh Mela in 2013 in Allahabad, in India, the largest gathering of humanity, every 12 years for the Maha, and then every 3 years for the smaller one with 40 million people instead of 100 million people.
Oh, so you were in the Kumbh Mela in 2013, is that right?
I did. That's
That was
correct.
my first one as well. And I went
Oh,
there very nervously. Although I grew up
yeah,
in India, I went there very nervously because it's a mecca. It's totally like an ocean of people.
yeah.
So I skipped the days, the full moon days when it's like super full. So I went there
That's
on
when
the
I was
half
there.
moon days.
I was there on the full moon day. I was there.
I didn't do that.
I was there on the bathing day, the most auspicious bathing day, which it was in February 2013,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
it and it was amazing. I mean, in the era we live in right now in COVID, it's sort of hard to imagine because it's
yeah.
over the course of 55 days, 100 million people show up at the festival, and on the peak days, it's like 35 million people bathing in the Ganges River together. It's an odd experience, but I loved it. And I've been I was a founding board member for Burning Man and the Burning Man Festival. And in many ways, what Kumbh Mela and Burning Man have a lot in common. There are these little camps, and there are each camp has a bit of a theme, and usually the Kumbh Mela camps have gurus, the Baba is the person whose theme defines the camp. And I just loved it. I loved it because the level of devotion, you see people oh, what do they call it? It starts with an N. Not the wise. They're the wise guys who walk around naked, who are ascetics. I can't
Yes.
remember what do you call the sadhu? They're like the sadhus. The
Sadhus,
sadhus.
sadhus. Yeah,
Yes.
there are different types among them. Yeah.
Yeah, the sadhus. They're just fascinating in terms of how they've devoted themselves to Hinduism, really. But it's even the different sects of Hinduism. So long story short is I've always found it interesting to learn from people who are different than me.
In fact, when people ask me if I've been to Burning Man, I tell them that so far I haven't felt the need because whenever I feel like going to Burning Man, I come to India and I go to remote places in India or remote places in the Indian subcontinent because you see all kinds of things and people living even in extreme conditions in Rajasthan or in the Himalayas, people living almost with very little food or living up in the mountains. It's a very different,
Yeah,
it's really fascinating.
I love India on so many levels. It's a place I know that I have lived in a past life at least once and maybe multiple times. And I've been fascinated by the festivals of India. I've gone to arts festivals in Western India, Rajasthan, and okay.
Jaipur.
Jaipur, exactly. There's a big, famous arts festival there. There's actually an arts festival. So there's an arts festival in Jaipur, and then all of the artists who come to that, it's got a Sufi kind of flavor to it, and it's all of the people who come to it actually do a festival a week in advance in Nagaur, which is got a big fort in it. And I went to that, and that was awesome. There are only 300 of us at the festival for 5 days, staying in these big luxury tents. And there were 150 musicians who were going to be playing in Jaipur the next week. And they just played for us. And it was sublime. It was, ay vey. It was so nice. So, and I'm in a relationship with an Israeli. So, I just said oy vey. I can say, you can say that I'm very much of a global citizen, I guess.
Yeah. And one thing I find interesting about you is that you've gone very fluidly between tech companies or companies which have the potential to go IPO and also lived among the poorest of the poor. You have gone through these things so easily. One of the things that America gets blamed for, criticized for, is that we call ourselves a capitalistic country. And we also say that we have capitalism with a heart, the social security system and all those things. But I see very few examples of people who have lived their entire career and their entire life with compassion as the basis. Do you think it's growing? Do you see people doing that more and more? Or what's happening, in your opinion?
Yeah, I do think it's growing. I think Mark Benioff at Salesforce is an example of someone who has really built compassion into the corporate culture of his company, as has Tony Hsieh at Zappos, and there's a whole collection of people. John Mackey at Whole Foods Markets. He's the one who really sort of helped coin the term conscious capitalist. I think the reason it's growing, actually, I think it's partly growing because more women are coming into leadership. And I actually think that's a great thing because I think women bring more compassion to the workplace. And actually, because a woman in the workplace, especially in leadership, is often the other, they
That's true.
understand and have empathy for other people. And therefore, there's an element of a willingness and openness to listen to voices that might not normally be heard. I think part of the reason that compassion is making some inroads in the business world is partly because there's growing social science evidence that creating a workplace that is not toxic, creating a workplace that feels like people feel appreciated and recognized and loved, and a workplace full of compassion is actually good for the business. So it's not just good for you as a human, not just good for society, but it's actually, has a positive financial effect in the long term for the business. And having more of that evidence. I remember there was an article on the cover of Harvard Business Review. Actually, it was an article. There's the whole issue. The whole issue was, it had a happy face on it. And the whole issue was dedicated to the idea that if you create happy employees and culture, you create happy customers, and then you create happy investors. And create a virtuous circle. And this is something I've talked about in my Peak model, one of my books called Peak, How Great Companies Get Their Mojo from Maslow. I've talked about this for a long time, but now there's so much evidence of it that companies realize that they better be a little more compassionate, because if they're not, they're going to lose their people. And then they'll build a bad reputation as well. And especially for millennials, both millennial customers as well as millennial employees, they want to spend their money in places where they have some pride in who they're spending it with, or who they're spending their time with if they're an employee. So,
in the last few years, you were a part of Airbnb, which by all means has been the fastest growing company in the hotel or alternatives to conventional hotel industry. But like many other businesses that have been hit by the pandemic, I'm sure they've gone through their fair share of changes. What do you see happening in terms of people losing jobs, people losing careers, and the whole landscape is changing? What are the opportunities in it for companies as well as for individuals, especially those who have lost their jobs and things like that?
well, it's certainly a very challenging and uncertain time. There's no doubt about that. I'll say a couple thoughts. One is specific to Airbnb. Airbnb is in the travel industry, and the travel industry, of all the industries out there today, is maybe the one globally that has been hit the hardest. And I have a long history in the travel industry and in the hospitality business. So I'm very sad about that. Airbnb had to actually lay off 25% of its staff in the spring, but the company did it with a very compassionate approach in a variety of ways, in terms of how much severance they were given, the fact they could keep their laptop even though it was company property, the fact that the company set up a website for all of those 1,900 employees, so that people could say, I want to get an Airbnb employee. They could go to an Airbnb website that actually showed all of their employees who had been laid off, and allowed you as a recruiter or another company to go out and find them. So it just created an efficiency, in essence, a marketplace for their employees. These are things that are unheard of historically. So what I will say is that Airbnb and Brian Chesky, so Brian's the co-founder, CEO, and he's my mentee for 7.5 years now. I've been his mentor. I'm very proud of him in terms of what he did in the worst of times. And of course, we were talking a lot during that time, because it really built the reputation of the company. The truth is, people think, well, God, your reputation gets tarnished in a downturn. Well, in fact, Airbnb is quite the opposite. So I would say that's one critical thing to know. Beyond that, I would say, how do we look at this time as an opportunity as opposed to just a crisis? Well, for those of you out there who've lost your job, or are worried about losing your job, or you've lost your company, like the business went out of business, you are being forced to go through a transition. And I created something called the Modern Elder Academy 2.5 years ago in Mexico on a beachfront, which is why I live down here. And Modern Elder Academy is dedicated to helping people go through their transitions. Our primary focus is people in midlife, but we've now defined midlife quite broadly, because we've had people as young as 30 and as old as 88 come to it, but at the average age is 54. And what we've come to realize is that transitions are part of life. There's a word called liminal. To be liminal is to be in between two states. It's to be in limbo. It's to be sort of like, in the rites of passage, there's 3 stages to it. There's, the ending of the relationship within the past. And then the 3rd stage is the beginning of the future. The middle stage is the difficult stage. It's the dark stage. You don't know where you are. You left the past. You're not there in the future yet. Joseph Campbell, his whole idea of hero's journey is about this middle stage. The caterpillar to the butterfly journey, the middle stage is the cocoon, which is dark and gooey. So many of you may be feeling dark and gooey right now, but it is in that middle stage where you have the capacity to turn yourself into the butterfly. And what you have to do is be willing to be liminal, meaning being vulnerable, give you this time and space, the opportunity to see what emerges in terms of what it is that you've always wanted to do, or what are the talents you have developed, the mastery you've developed that you could now apply somewhere else. I call that same seed, different soil. So I could talk a lot longer about this, but what I'll just say, if someone wants to read more about that, my book, Wisdom at Work, The Making of a Modern Elder, talks about a lot. I have a daily blog called Wisdom Well, which is on the Modern Elder Academy MEA website. And it's a daily blog that is about all these subjects. And obviously the Modern Elder Academy website will introduce you to our programs, which reopen in October, and they go October through July here in Mexico. And so you can learn more about, how do you address navigating your transitions in midlife or at any stage in your life, and do so in a way that feels good. Because frankly, most of us have never been taught in adulthood how to go through transitions.
Yeah, that's true. Especially since you have been an advocate of rituals and especially festivals, we
Yes.
have forgotten how to celebrate transitions. We have forgotten how to celebrate. There's the bar mitzvah and the bat mitzvah in the Jewish traditions. We have similar traditions of coming of age in various Indian traditions, and it's literally universal. And Joseph Campbell talks about that. We have forgotten that, and I'm so glad that you're trying to reinstate that with the Elders Academy that you've started. Can you tell us a little more about it? I clearly see that what inspired you was the lack of these, things. When people go through transitions, a lot of us are lost, and many of us even go through depression
Yes.
because of not having somebody to look up to or to learn from. Can you tell us more about what you do, the process that you
Yes.
have created now?
Well, let me give you the background. So there are two pieces of background that are, I think, important to know here. Number one is during the Great Recession, 2008 to say 2010, I went through a very difficult time. I was 47, 48 years old. I had a flatline experience where I actually died and then came back to life. My company was falling apart because of the recession, and there were a bunch of other things that were happening. I was really struggling. Fortunately, I had friends who helped support me. Fortunately, one of my best friends is a life coach, and she was very helpful. But I didn't really know who to turn to. And men in particular are not as good at understanding the safety net, or what I call emotional insurance, the emotional insurance that surrounds them. During that time, during the Great Recession, I had 5 friends commit suicide, all men, age
Oh,
42 to 52. None of them knew each other, so there was none of them were, but it just often because of the circumstances of their work life and their financial life. So that's, back then I think I just noted to myself, why is it that midlife is such a difficult time? Why is it that people don't know how to actually get through this difficult time? Then I was asked to join Airbnb soon after I sold my company. I knew I needed to do something new, and I learned in the first few months at Airbnb that, wow, yes, I was twice the age of the average employee. They started to call me the modern elder, which is, they said, you're as curious as you are wise. What's different than the traditional elder is that you're really curious, and you're not just the person who dispenses wisdom. You're the person who actually is as much a wisdom seeker as you are a wisdom keeper. And so, in fact, Brian Chesky, the CEO, said, we thought we hired you for your knowledge, but what we've really gotten is your wisdom. And I swear I just had never thought of the difference between wisdom and knowledge. I just thought they were the same thing. And they're quite different. Knowledge is something you can learn on Google. Wisdom is something you learn, frankly, often either, if you're lucky enough, from someone who's wiser than you, or through your own experience and mistakes. I started to generate this idea that, okay, if they're calling me the modern elder, and if wisdom is really valuable. Knowledge, all the knowledge of the world is on this little machine here in my pocket. All of the knowledge of the world. But the wisdom of the world is not as easily found. So what's scarce is often what's valuable. And I started to ask myself the question, wow, Peter Drucker, the famous management theorist 60 years ago, came up with the term knowledge workers. And he said the working world will be controlled and, led by knowledge workers in the future. Nobody had no idea. No one knew what he was talking about. And of course, now 7 of the 10 most valuable companies in the world today are knowledge companies. They're tech companies. And so what I think today is we're moving into an era where the knowledge worker, everybody's a knowledge worker. If we have a phone and a laptop, you're probably a knowledge worker. And I think we're moving into an era where the term knowledge worker needs to be retired. And instead, it's about the wisdom worker. And the wisdom worker is somebody who's actually able to discern patterns. It's not about knowledge and just gathering knowledge and gaining knowledge and which is almost like an arithmetic math equation of plus, 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 plus. Wisdom is a division equation. It's actually distilling down what's essential and having enough of a discernment to see what's important and what's not, to be able to know how do you operate with that kind of editing function. And for me, that editing function was very valuable at Airbnb because it helped me to focus the company at a time when the company really needed to be focused. All of that led me to saying, I'm going to create the world's first midlife wisdom school. Call it the Modern Elder Academy, or for short, just MEA. Build a campus on about 5 acres of land here on the beach in Mexico. And we've been doing this for 2.5 years. We've had 750 alumni now from 24 countries.
Wow, you already have 750 alumni.
750
Amazing.
alumni from 24 countries. And it's been a phenomenal experience because there are so many people in transition today. And there's so many people at all ages who'd like to understand, how do you cultivate and harvest your wisdom? How do you do that? I understand how to learn something, but how do I cultivate and harvest my wisdom? And that's really what we help teach people. And we actually have Dr. Srikumar Rao coming in March, Indian-American professor who used to teach at Columbia University, and he's got a huge following. He's coming to teach a workshop on creativity and personal mastery. And we basically have workshops every single week from mid-October till the end of July.
I somehow missed the fact that it was in Mexico because when I had to choose between where to go when the pandemic struck, I went from India to South Korea, which is where everybody was in a mask. So I came to the Bay Area, stayed there for a month, and 2 days before California went into shelter in place, came to Chihuahua and then Cuernavaca without knowing Espanol. So 3 months I learned Indian and Mexican cooking, as well as the basics of Espanol to be able to at least say "Cómo estás? Todo bien?" And fascinating. How did you choose Mexico as the place to do your Elder Academy? I love it, by the way. To anybody who is in Mexico, I love, if there's any place other than India or the United States I would consider, it would be Mexico to retire.
Thank you. I grew up in Southern California, but I didn't learn Spanish. I learned French, which is why I called my company Joie de Vivre. But I grew up in Southern California, so I was surrounded by lots of people who had, family had immigrated from Mexico. So I was always curious about Mexico, but I wouldn't say I knew it that well. And then about 10 years ago, some friends of mine were coming down to Southern Baja. So Southern Baja, what people know in Southern Baja is Cabo San Lucas, which is sort of a resort town. And they were not coming to Cabo. They were coming to an area an hour north called Todos Santos and Pescadero, which is a farming and area and village. It's pretty remote. It's nice and quiet. It's just strikingly beautiful in terms of desert and ocean and tropical and mountains and farmland. And so I came here with them and I just fell in love with the place. So I actually built a home here on the beach, or actually didn't build, I bought a home and then renovated it. And I was just going to have it as a home to go to on occasion because it's not that far from the Bay Area or from Los Angeles. And one day when I was writing my book here in the home, I had this almost exactly 3 years ago. I had this brainstorm as I was running down the beach. I call it a Baha aha, an aha, like an epiphany, a Baha aha. My Baha aha was, oh wow, why is there no school for people in midlife that helps them with long life learning? So if you've heard the phrase lifelong learning is something you do for, from age 25 and on. You just supposed to be, and it's sort of a DIY thing, do it yourself. Lifelong learning, you're supposed to learn to figure out how do you learn over the course of a lifetime. But the truth is, lifelong learning at age 25 is different than it is at age 65. And so what I wanted to do was create a place that was dedicated to cultivating and harvesting wisdom, especially for those in midlife, but also helping people to see that their life can be as deep as it is long. And why I want to do that is because we're living in a world where we're going to live longer. That at least longevity around the world has been growing for the last 150 years. So longevity so we're living longer, and yet power, especially in a digital society, is moving younger, and the world is changing faster. And those three variables, living longer, power moving younger, world changing faster, has a lot of people in their 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s and later bewildered because they feel somehow they're getting the game of life wrong. And so that's sort of where we are. And I can just say that Mexico felt like the right place to do it because it felt the culture here, interesting. The culture here has a fascination with, it's sort of similar to India actually, fascination with people dying and having an afterlife.
Yes, Dios de,
In Mexico,
Dios
Dia
de
de los Muertos.
Muertos.
See, Dia de los Muertos, a film called Coco, a Pixar film that's very famous. It's actually
Yes.
the #1 grossing film in Mexican history, an American film. And so, in India, my first experience in India was was in Varanasi. That was where I spent my first few days in India, is in Varanasi. That's crazy. So I spent to have come so. And Varanasi is very much a place where it's a day of the dead.
People come to die.
People come to die, and then they get burned, they get cremated, or they get burned. The body get burned, and they go and they're put on the river, on the Ganges, and with the knowledge that they're going to come back, and so there's a lot of interesting synchronicities between or comparabilities between India and Mexico.
Indeed. In fact, there's this concept, if you have read the Tibetan Book of the Dead of Bardo, which is what you're talking about, the liminal zone. Like what happens when you've let go on one side and you're yet to start another project. And they talk, of course, about the time between one life and another. But I'm like, you can use that in any transition, whether it's from one job to another, from one state of health to another, if you're going through a health emergency, from one stage of life to another. And I'm so grateful you've created something, because the idea of growing old in America had become like, oh, you're over the hill, and like you're gone, you're done for life. Right. So people are, at least when I was in the US, I was there till 4 years ago. Now I'm traveling around the world. In American culture, age has been a liability for at least the last several years, several decades. So bringing respect to that, bringing a sense of purpose to that, you know what I mean? That is really essential, whether it's through books like Eat, Pray, Love, and there are different ways in which people are trying to make sense out of their life beyond the so-called, peak in terms of money making, or in terms of the acquisitive phase of life. And what do you feel is the role of elders? In what ways can elders serve a society and,
Yes. Let me say that I think the role of the elders is evolving. And there are some cultures in the world, India being one of them, where elders have there's a certain reverence and respect still paid. But I actually think we're now moving from an era where elders it's not about the reverence of elders, it's about the relevance of the elders. And relevance and reverence are two different things. Reverence, it means that people have to do it because it's part of the culture. And that's good, because actually I think historically elders had something to offer, for sure, obviously, and still do. But we live in an era, again, people don't go to grandma and grandpa to ask questions, they go to Google.
yes, yes.
And so I think that what's going on is it's important for an elder to be as curious as they are wise. Because if you're curious, you know what's relevant. And then you can take the wisdom you have and apply it to modern day problems and in the right context. And that's what I learned at Airbnb. So I had some wisdom to offer, but I had to understand the context to know how to provide it in a way that I could translate it to younger people, so they didn't feel like I was lecturing them. So how do I see elders today? I mean, elders have always had a role that is a bridge between the past and the future. And why the elders have actually lost some of their relevance in the world is because the future has been so quick in changing. So we
Yeah.
went from agriculture to an industrial to a tech world in terms of the economy. And when we moved from agriculture to industrial, that was one place where the elder lost, because in many ways, the land wisdom, the wisdom you had about agriculture and understanding the seasons and understanding what works and what didn't, wasn't so important in an industrial era where brawn, frankly, being strong was important. And, an elder often was not physically strong. And then you go to the tech era, and an elder, if they didn't grow up with technology, maybe very, very unsure of themselves and unclear on how they have anything to offer. But I actually think the interesting era we're moving into is an era where, okay, so we went from agriculture to industrial, and then industrial to tech. And the tech part of the era has moved to AI even more. The more we move into this AI place, the more the elder becomes valuable. Why? Because compassion, emotions, emotional intelligence, intuition, creativity, being able to ask good questions. Google is phenomenal at answering questions. It's not very good at asking questions. And Siri basically just repeats what you said. Siri has no clue what's going on inside of you. So what I think we're doing is we're moving into an era where the scarcity in the world is wisdom and emotional intelligence and the human qualities of what does it mean to become, a more evolved human. And if that is true, elders have a great place to play here, because emotional intelligence, unlike IQ, which is pretty much common throughout, all of someone's life, EQ grows with time, on average. Not for everybody, but on average, it grows with time, because your pattern recognition of understanding your emotions and other people's emotions gets better. And so as a result, I do think that we're going to start seeing more modern elders in the workplace, especially in places like Silicon Valley, where you have the brilliant technologists who tend to be young. Again, these are gross generalizations, but they tend to be young. But they don't have a lot of experience in building teams, or in building or creating a strategy, or understanding how to address the intrinsic and extrinsic motivating factors for their employees. So these are the kinds of things that someone who's been around a few decades in the workplace can be helpful with. So I'm excited about the future of intergenerational collaboration.
In fact, I'm reminded of Singularity University and many other the people have these worries or concerns that computers will soon surpass us in practically everything. And I tell
Mhm.
them that I don't think they can still be, they don't have the ability to emote. They don't yet have the ability to think about what they want, what is their
Mhm.
intrinsic desire. Who am I? That question is
Mhm.
probably difficult. I grew up in the AI era, by the way. My undergraduate thesis was on using AI in those days for computer-based learning, computer-based
Interesting.
education in the 1980s.
Interesting.
And all along, the whole technology, whether it is AI applied to the CAD/CAM industry, electronic design automation, and then in the biotech industry, with understanding of the genome and all that stuff. So, but what AI does not address is exactly what you said.
Mhm.
The computer doesn't have any motivation. It does what you
Mhm.
tell it to do. It's a
Mhm.
very intelligent. It has
Mhm.
high IQ. It can do
Mhm.
exactly what you ask it to do. But can
Right.
it ask those questions? Can it try to understand what its own motivation is? And then that
Mm.
comes to the question of who am I and what is my purpose in life? What am I doing here? So, where do you see that going? Do you see computers or automated systems in our lifetime being able to develop that kind of emotional intelligence? Do you see that
I,
happening?
I am so out of my league in trying to answer that. So I can't tell you from the technology side in terms of will we. It feels like it's possible. Yes, it does feel like it's possible that you could create the kind of technology that allows a computer to actually intuit things. And but I don't know. How do you help a computer feel a oneness with the world, a
Exactly.
spiritual connection? I don't think the consciousness side of it. I don't know. I think so. I think the emotional side of it, yes, possibly. The
Yes.
spiritual side of it, I don't know. But what I think is true is that humans need to feel that what they are able to do is to double down on their humanity.
Hmm.
And which means, how do I learn how to be more compassionate? How do I learn how to be more intuitive? How do I learn how to be um, a better leader? Uh, and it's for other humans. And I think that's where the opportunity lies. So when people sometimes say, we come to the Modern Elder Academy and they're 52 years old and they say, you know what, I think it's time for me to learn how to become a software developer. And I look at them and say, my dear, this is a woman I'm thinking of. You have become a soft skills developer for the last 30 years. Soft skills development we need more of that. Software development, we need it too. But I would just say you've already got some mastery in your soft skills development. How do we double down on that mastery in such a way that you can actually offer that to people who are younger than you in a way where they value it? And so that's what we spend time with her on, for example. And that is, I think, she's just a tip of the iceberg of people in the future who are going to realize that, wow, in an era of AI, what we need to do is double down on the human skills.
That's true. And in fact, we are going through these unprecedented changes in demographics as well as in politics. I'm not really a big political jockey, but I find it very interesting that at a time when we're all facing this challenge from a virus, we are so divided. We've become more polarized. We've
Yeah.
become less tolerant. And I hope it's a passing phase. But what do you see
Yeah.
coming in the next few years? Because it's not just the United States or India, it's happening globally in many, many countries. Many tribal feelings have become stronger. But
Yeah.
it's like us versus them has grown. What do you
Yeah.
see happening, and where do you see the world going, if I may ask you?
Yeah. It's a scary premise. I wrote a blog post recently called "The United States of America,"
Uh-huh.
and knotted being like a knot. When something is knotted, it's very hard to actually break it loose
Untangle.
and untangle it. So we've got a tangled state politically in the United States, but also in other places. And metaphorically, the way you actually untie a knot is you try to create some slack, and by creating some slack, you're actually able to. Well, we live in an era right now where, excuse the expression, we don't give anybody any slack. Now, there's a Slack app tool. I'm not talking about that. No, I'm not talking about the messaging app Slack. I'm talking about the fact that when you give someone Slack, you imagine or you assume their best intentions. We live in an era where people are constantly assuming worst intentions, and that actually just means there's no slack, and so that means the knot gets tighter, and we get more divided on sort of on other sides of. There's something called oh gosh, what is that? Tug of war. A tug of war is when two people try to, like, two groups are trying to pull each other. And if there was a knot in the middle and a tug of war, that knot's just going to get tighter and tighter. The pendulum swings, and there was a pendulum swinging the last 30 to 40 years in the direction of globalization. And in terms of how do we create a smaller world, and how do we create more, easier borders to cross. And I think it had its place in the world, and it actually made a lot of improvements in certain parts of the world. It also exacerbated some changes that were about to happen, going from an industrial to a tech era. And so when you see, for example, in the United States, where the strongest advocates are for nationalism, the strongest advocates for many of Donald Trump's policies, and I'm not here to beat up or say good things about Donald Trump. I'm not a fan of him, that's for sure. But what he did is he tapped into a lot of fear. And the fear was, I'm no longer relevant. I'm someone who has an industrial mind, not a technology mind. I'm someone who grew up in this country, and there's all these people who don't look like me in this country now, who come from the biggest fear is immigration from Mexico, interestingly enough. And there's an element of, we are creating scapegoats for a difficult situation, because going from one era to another era has its victims. And our governments are not doing a very good job of reducing the victimhood and helping people understand the transition of what's going through, and how government can maybe help support them through that time, or companies can do that, or whatever it is. And so I would just say, I think we got to get to the other side of this, but I think the other side of this is going to probably require some major government funding in the United States to help people feel a little bit less in fear. And so I think that'll be interesting to see what happens. But I think the path we're on right now is not good for the world, because the COVID's a perfect example of it. If we were in a globalized world, we probably would have had a more globalized response to COVID. And that would have been helpful. And instead we didn't. And then in the United States, just forget the globalization of the US in terms of, like, this is 50 states, there's been no concerted effort at the governmental and federal level. It's been left up to states and often local communities, which almost means everybody stays at home, because you have to live by the rules in your community. But I'm gonna stop on that one, because I'll get depressed.
Yeah. Well, interestingly, like you, I'm quite a contrarian, and hardly anybody's traveling. And I love to travel, especially when nobody else is traveling. So I've been looking at opportunities to travel. And you are right now in Baja. I was there in Cuernavaca, and then I came back to India. It's hard to travel from one state to another in India also, because of the lockdowns, because of the safety. Each state has its own rules on quarantine and all that. But I'm actually getting, since you are in the travel and hospitality industry, I feel there'll be a new generation, new genre of travelers who are actually willing to risk even getting sick and in foreign places. But travel is not just about seeing more concrete and more places. It's about understanding, isn't it?
Oh,
You
sure.
travel quite a bit.
Yeah, I actually think one of the for the travel industry, one of the potential collateral benefits, there's been all kinds of costs of the pandemic to the travel industry, but a collateral benefit is the following. Not just the fact people will have pent up desire to travel. Yes, that'll be true. But actually, although if we go into a worse and worse economy, travel is one of the first things people cut back on in terms of spending. But here's the thing that could happen. We are seeing many, many companies endorsing the idea of remote work. So there's a trend that's maybe 10 years old, which is the digital nomad trend. And it's people who feel comfortable enough that their mobile device and their Wi-Fi connection can allow them to do work on the road. And not just on the road, going from city to city, but literally, instead of going 2 days here and 2 days there, which is what the road warrior does, a digital nomad goes 2 months here and then 2 months there. And they actually, they work in co-working spaces, and they live affordably, often on Airbnb. And it's not a home away from home, it's a home instead of home. They don't have a primary home. If that is the future, not of everybody, but let's say let's say it represents 0.1% of Americans today. Let's say by 20 years from now, it represents 5 or 10% of Americans. The math on that is huge.
Huge.
Because what it means is people are traveling. They're not traveling as often, meaning they're, instead of 2 days here, 2 days there, they're doing 2 months here, 2 months there. They're actually doing, the example I've used is they spend, the winter in Bali, the spring in Baja, the summer in Boston, and the fall in Austin. And that becomes their year of being in 4 locations. That creates a whole new opportunity for the travel industry. And really for something that's in between a hotel and a long-term lease as a residential tenant. I think that's a really interesting opportunity. And there are companies that I'm talking to right now, working with and mentoring CEOs who are focused on that kind of customer.
In fact, there's at least a few attempts in India to work from the mountains. A lot of people, especially in summer, as you know, it gets very, very hot, even for people who have lived all their life in India. In the tropics, it can go well over 110 degrees, 120 degrees, and it's humid too. So people actually rent a home in the Himalayas or in the foothills for a month or two and work from there with good Wi-Fi connection. Of course, that's much easier for the knowledge workers, but people are even saying, why not take 2 months off and do something, maybe cultivate land, go to an organic farm and actually live there for some time. So things are changing, and it's also bringing, India is not just one country. We have many tribes all around the country, just like we see in Europe. There are so many tribes. So it's bringing these tribes together. It's bringing people, and that's one reason I wanted to talk about it. On one hand, there are these forces of divisiveness and people trying to run away from each other. But there are these nomads who actually are not mad. They're actually joyful in learning from each other and traveling and living in different areas. I was one of them for the last 4 years. I've been to 22 states and lived at least a month in 3 months in Rajasthan and different places. And now I'm trying to do that globally, not so easy during the pandemic. But I see a real opportunity to bring the world together. What do you think?
The sadhu goes mainstream. I just wrote a note to myself, it's interesting that the word nomad is no mad. I'm not mad.
It's not mad.
Yeah, I like that. I like that. Although there's 2 ways to think of the word mad. Mad is like angry, and then there's mad crazy. And a lot of people who are nomads are sort of crazy because they're living a life that's very different than the rest of the culture. I do think the idea of moving into a more nomadic world is sort of fascinating. It's, I love it and you love it. And some people say, well, if you had young children, you couldn't do that. It's like, well, actually, I know lots of people with young children who are nomads, and they do it, either affordably or luxuriously. That you can do it either way. So I think the things that have it's sort of so at odds with where the world is today that it's almost unfathomable for people to imagine it, because people are doing quite the opposite. They're hunkering down with family. They're staying in place. But the role of a visionary, the role of a futurist, is to imagine the thing that most people can't see today. And because I think cultural curiosity is a long-term phenomena, because Wi-Fi connections are only getting better around the world, because devices are getting smaller and more mobile, because healthcare is actually improving in the developing world. People do medical tourism. They literally go to Thailand to actually have cosmetic surgery. They go to Malta to island of Malta to have dental work done, because there are very good medically trained people there in certain specialties, and you can actually go have a vacation and have less expensive care. So I would just say I'm a big believer in this. I think the question is the timing and how big is the audience ultimately. But we're talking about moving from a tiny base right now to something that, even if it was 5 or 10% of the population, that would change a huge amount of how the world works.
And you know why I've been thinking about it? When you go back into history of human beings, before there were nation states and all that, there are always travelers, whether it was a Columbus who discovered America, or people who came all the way to India. Actually, Columbus discovered America looking for India, but
Yeah.
likewise, there were people from China who came to India thousands of years ago. The Buddha and Buddha's disciples traveled from what's today Nepal and India. He actually he was born in present day Nepal, and he went all the way to Bihar. And then the Ashoka sent his people around the world. Even Jesus Christ, from what I know, the historical Jesus Christ, went into desert land and is supposed to have traveled thousands of miles. Don't know the exact details because it's sketchy. I know that Guru Nanak went all the way to Arabia, who was the guru of the Sikhs. But travel, and especially seeing different perspectives on life, that adds to emotional intelligence and wisdom, saying things from a completely different vantage, from culturally different, because we are getting more and more global, at least in the knowledge industry. For Airbnb to understand how people in Africa want it versus how they want it in the US, it can be widely different. So,
Yes.
that's what prompts me to think a certain percentage of population will probably go around understanding. So there are no cultural collisions. And
Mm-hmm.
the world has to function together. We can no longer go back to being separate, and we cannot keep building walls.
Well, I think, if we look at some of the most vexing problems in the world today, the walls aren't going to solve them. Whether it is climate change, whether it's COVID, whether it is AI, and viruses around technology. A tech virus knows no borders. So these are things that actually require a concerted, interconnected, interdependent solution. And so my hope is that that's one of the key lessons we're going to have here. And we'll look back at this era and say, this was an era of fear. And there were some politicians around the world who fed that fear through sort of nationalistic policies and policies that pitted one person versus another, because it actually helped their career, and there was enough of a fear about the other, going back to that subject, that
Yes.
it was
Yes.
easy to scapegoat. So, so we'll see. I mean, you know, I don't know. We'll
Yeah.
see.
Well, I like your humility in saying we don't have all the answers, and
Right.
we'll find out
Yeah.
as we grow
Yeah.
up. So, what do you think you'll do now that you're growing up? What next? Are you going to continue the Elder Academy, or are you seeing potentially new things, new different ventures you could potentially get into?
One of the things we're doing with with MEA, Modern Elder Academy, is we've learned that people actually want to buy into the lifestyle. They want to live. We're a social enterprise, so 62% of our people have been on some form of scholarship because, in essence, I wanted to set it up in a way where we were creating socioeconomic diversity, and that was great. And what we've seen is people have come here and they say, "Oh God, I wish I could live this lifestyle, you know, year round." And so we're actually working on what we call a regenerative community
Oh,
where
wow.
and the regenerative community will have a farm, and then it'll have housing, people's homes, and then in the center of it will be the wisdom school of MEA. And it's a place where people can come and do week-long programs, but they could also come for sabbaticals and for gap years. And the whole premise is how do you create a new kind of regenerative community where you're regenerating the agriculture, you're regenerating the sense of community with the other people there intergenerationally, and you're regenerating yourself personally with the wisdom school. And so instead of, you know, the US is sort of famous for its retirement communities that are built around a golf course. Well, instead of being built around a golf course, we're built around a wisdom school. And so we are looking at 2 locations beyond Mexico. Our Mexico locations has a part of it called Sage, Baja Sage, which is the residential community that's being built. And so we're looking at doing this in other places in the United States. We've had lots of people from around the world come and say, we'd like to have us do it there, but we're actually just starting in the United States because that's the market we know best. So that's one thing. And then I just continue to be curious about life, and my Wisdom Well blog allows me to write about those curiosities.
Well, again, I'm so glad we had this conversation. This is literally the first time I'm talking to you one-on-one. I was quite nervous because I usually get to know people a little bit before, but time was such, I was like, I remember this man who talked about vulnerability, about compassion at the Center for Compassion at Stanford almost 9 or 10 years ago,
Yeah,
2013, I think.
yeah,
And and I was like, wow, got to talk to him. And I'm
yeah.
glad you accepted my invitation. And here we are. At the very least, we get to know each other. And
Mm.
hopefully, those who are listening here, if you have any questions, what would be the best way that they can reach out to you? Is it the blog, or are there other ways they can find you?
I mean, yeah, if they want to find me, the blog's great. LinkedIn's not a bad way to reach out to me.
Okay.
I post the blog, the daily blogs on my LinkedIn profile. You can send me a message on LinkedIn. I don't read my LinkedIn messages, but my assistant does. And so she will pass those on to me typically. So yeah,
Great. And if anybody has any questions for me, you know how to find me. Again, thanks a lot. And I'm grateful that there are people like you who have given a new meaning to what it's like to be an elder, as well as what it's like to be a compassionate business person. And we
thank
need
you.
both these things very badly in the world today. And thank you again. And
Thank you.
thank you all for listening. So